And our objective here is to be bold and provocative and hopefully inspire conversation about this topic. I want to center us a little bit on this idea of genius loci, if I could, which comes through my learning from a brilliant landscape level architect named John Tillman Lyle, who taught at one of our institutes of learning here in California. He talks about spirit of place, or genius loci, as being the sort of, if you will, if you think about the metaphor to wine, the terroir, or the flavor out of which the land and the people on a piece of land are born. The goal today is simply to set the landscape for a set of challenging and hopefully helpful ideas. And then ultimately, in webinar 2, we'll talk about 2 cases, 2 applications of this approach to reconceiving community conservation. One on the U.S. island of Kauai, and the other down on the Front Range in Fort Collins. The model for how we produce and consume begins with how we design our community. Every company of any size, big, adversely impacting extractive firms like Anglo-American, large global software firms, the biggest car companies in the world, they all began with a person going to a town hall and getting a business license. And that interface between commerce and community is what we're going to explore, and I would argue strongly that the reason we've made extraordinarily little progress against changing unsustainable patterns of production and consumption is because we have not properly conceived how community development works and the relationship between community and nature. The problem is this model is fundamentally wrong. It's dramatically incomplete, and as you'll see if you decide to take the online course, we're going to talk about the dramatic failures of macroeconomic theory to explain that bottom box accurately in terms of the relationship of nature to community. An alternate way of thinking about it is a more holistic or systems level approach, whereby healthy ecosystems, beginning with healthy soil, drive a healthy and conservation-based rather than consumption-based economy, which then gives rise to healthy communities of people and the other creatures that we have the privilege of sharing the planet with. And I think that urban planning is largely a failure. If we look at sprawl, if we look at the dramatic backbreaking divide between the rich and poor, if we see how this is magnified in how we set up our towns and cities, and if we see that there is a dramatic divide between technical urban planning and holistic community development, we can say perhaps that we usually get it wrong. I think it's a very useful idea. It's also useful to think about it because we make a mistake when we artificially talk about the urban wilderness divide. It's a continuum, it's not a divide, and I think that's what gets our planning on the wrong track quite often. That the consumer economy is broken because we misconceive macroeconomic theory. And so, I would argue that we have largely alienated ourselves from the environment in these windowless, soulless conference rooms where we do much of this work. And we've made the environment the other and forgotten about ecology. And the fact that, again, I would argue, and there's people on our economics faculty here at the university who think I'm a bit of a problem because I make these kinds of statements, but look, guys, the material economy is based on ecosystems, whether we like to admit it, remember it, or not. And if we crush those ecosystems, our material economy and our arrogance about the solutions provided by technology will be our very end. So, I think we need to reconceive our idea of community development starting at the rootstock. And, this picture here is meant to typify a process, which is to say that if we don't start at the beginning, we're going to get it wrong. Somebody built what looks to be a very expensive building here, and there's a terrace that doesn't really seem to lead anywhere. And to me, this is a visual representation of what a lot of community planning tends to look like. And these cruel exclusions, I think, can be solved to some extent by this idea that I mentioned earlier. Bringing fringe stakeholders with radically differing views into the discussion. I cannot tell you how many times I've sat with professional staff and town councilors and members of city councils who are planning workshops on community development, and they say, oh, well, people from that neighborhood or that group, we need to make sure they're not there because they'll create a problem. When a family acts that way, you get deep dysfunctionality. When a community acts that way, it's really a breach of the public trust. And it's easy for me to say. I've never been an elected official, but I do take this work quite seriously. And this work really requires a rethinking about how we do inclusion. It's not about stakeholders. I think the stakeholder concept has outlived its purpose. This is about citizenship and having a social conscience that says the people with the weakest voice and the most fringe perspective have to be part of the process, or else, we run the risk of getting it wrong. So I started testing this idea of regenerative development. And this is the profession of faith towards regenerative development that they've used in the city of Fort Collins. And it is a profession of faith, and that may sound a bit religious, but it's really quite secular. But this work is sacred work, protecting the land and stewardship. The community and its citizens and leaders shall consider all undertakings and projects for approval by first determining how this undertaking or project will measurably, over the medium and long term, improve the social, economic, and ecological well-being of those who are affected. In our next webinar, our goal will be to use some cases and to reconceive macroeconomics to see how we can actually practice this reconception of community development and look at this idea of scaffolding as a way of building a future that is inspiring and ennobling and deeply, deeply connected to the land. Because what's true is the law will never protect it. I speak as a land use and natural resources lawyer. Alva Leopold said in 1933 of the American West, which includes the west of Canada, that to live in real harmony with this land seems to require either a degree of public regulation, which we will not tolerate, or a degree of private enlightenment, which we do not possess.
We are going to do a follow-up session on September the 18th, and after the session I'm going to send you a link on which you can just register directly for it. You won't have to register through the website. You'll be registering through WebEx. So if you want to do the follow-up session where Ed's going to talk about some case studies and the application of some of the things he's explained, then please feel free to do that. And that one's going to start at 1:15 in the afternoon on September the 18th, so you might want to mark that in your calendar. So it'll be from 1:15 until 2:15, so the timing is a little bit different. And thank you for completing the poll, and we look forward to having you back. As I said, we're going to do a more in-depth course where there's going to be some readings, and we're going to look at some of the work that Ed has talked about more specifically, and it's going to start on October the 16th.